Isaiah goes on in the text to affirm that God is the creator of all the wonderful things that God has made. That includes all people. And then as the text moves on, here's a second word of hope that I hear in it, is that this servant leader will have power to heal blindness. A lot of times we think of blindness as a physical malady that we find in the Gospels Jesus was able to heal. But throughout Scripture, and especially in the Gospels, Jesus also refers to blindness as a spiritual condition of unable to see things as they are, to perceive the spiritual realities or the regular, ordinary realities around us. Like those two characters in the story of the Good Samaritan that passed by first. They were blind to the pain and the reality of what was occurring with the man laying on the road. For us who are in the white church, who perhaps have been isolated, and we hear terms such as racism, and we think maybe it doesn't pertain to us. One of the blessings and the healings in my life was being part of Salem United Methodist in New Jersey and spending 6 years working with inner city kids and families, and especially under the ministry of my dear friend Garfield. I learned so much from him as a pastor, but also in being part of that community, I began to see things that I never saw before. Structures that were impacting my kids in the city, or ways that things were played out. I saw the racism firsthand of ways that it impacted people I loved who happened to be Black, and to have my own views challenged. I remember, some of you might be too young, but during the O.J. Simpson trial, I remember having a very different view of things than my dear friend Garfield. And while we remained close, I really benefited from hearing the pain when it was revealed one of the police was racist. To me, that didn't change anything. It changed everything for him. And I heard where I was blind in some things. Also, a couple years ago, I went to the UMCOR training on racism. And after all the work I had done and been part of a community that was multicultural, all the benefit of seminary of challenging some of my held views where I was blind to the pain that others experience in this culture, some things were lifted up for me that I realized were in me. At one point, they called out, they just had us sit with a piece of paper and they put words on the screen and they told us to write whatever image came first. One of those was Native American. And one of the first images, I confess, that came up in me suddenly was a very stereotypical thing of a 1950s kind of movie. I couldn't believe how much those were embedded in me after all the work and process that I had done. Those images are in us. Those images, everything that we heard as children, that our grandparents, who maybe lived in a different age, whispered to us about other races, the ways in which Blacks and other people of color were depicted in movies and television over the years, in books, they are in us. I was blind to how much that was still part of my view. I was also blind to the ways that I had an easier time as a white person than my friends of color. In Mike's family, he was, great-great-great-grandfather was a homesteader out in Kansas, which meant that you got land if you stayed for 5 years. When I was educated in school, that was lifted up as a courageous entrepreneurial thing, which I'm sure it was. He stayed the 5 years and he owned land. What I didn't know from that school and from my lessons was that people of color, blacks and Native Americans and others, were never allowed to benefit from the Homestead Act, which meant that our family received land from the government as a benefit. And other families never could. I think about the generations of being able to hold your own land and the economic benefit and privilege that they gave our family when other families equally deserving were not allowed. When they talk about, when in the news you hear the people talking about white privilege, that's the very kind of thing they're talking about. In my life, being from the suburbs and a good intact family, with parents who did teach me to love everyone, I benefited in ways that my friends of color were blocked. What gives me hope is that blindness is something God can overcome. We who have only been in the white circles cannot see the way that certain structures impact and oppress our friends who are black and other peoples of color. But God can overcome the blindness. In my life, it has helped immensely to have really good friends who are black, with whom I can share honestly, and they can call me on things, and they can expose my blindness. Their reality has been different for them than it was for me. If that's not a situation you have, you can read black authors. I encourage you this summer to read some and not shut down. You don't have to agree with everything you read. You can sit and listen to them as you were listening to a friend in pain. Listen to them, their experience, and what it's been like for them. I remember James Baldwin, a writer who was black from an earlier age, talking about those same cowboy and Indian movies, and how up to age 5 he thought he was white. And he identified with John Wayne and Gary Cooper. Then about 6 or 7, he realized he was black. And his world changed when he realized he was more like the Native Americans than the cowboys. And it was his people being shot at. I've never forgotten that. If you read someone else from a different perspective or color, just sit and listen. It's not about you. You don't have to be defensive. Sit and listen to the pain and what their perspective is. One thing the black community tells us is that whites often move to the center of the conversation. Read a book and sit and listen, just to listen, to learn, and to understand. Let me ask you a couple more questions. Have I done enough to inform myself about the sin of racism, its roots, and its historical and contemporary manifestations? Have I opened my heart to see how unequal access to economic opportunity, jobs, housing, and education on the basis of skin color, race, or ethnicity has denied and continues to deny the equal dignity of others? Is there a root of racism within me that blurs my vision of who my neighbor is? You can pause and stop the tape. Third of hope I have is in this passage is that this servant leader, Jesus Christ, was not only able to open up our eyes, but also to free the captives who are in prison and release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. Racism is a horrible prison. I have been, as many of us have, been reading into statistics. When we talk about systemic racism, again, coming close to the term and finding out what that really looks like. Black graduates of college are twice as likely to be unemployed as their white counterparts. Part of the reason might be that job applicants with white-sounding names get 50% more callbacks than applicants who are black with black-sounding names, whatever that is. In other words, same resume, same qualifications. But if it sounds like you're white, you're 50% more likely to get an interview. In education, black and white students who commit the same infractions of the school rules, black students are 3 times more likely to be suspended for the very same violations as their white counterparts. 30% higher rate of blacks are hit as pedestrians. It seems we are less likely to stop if you're a person of color. And we have the statistics in terms of the legal system and the school system. We don't see it because we're not experiencing it. But what the scripture promises is that it is possible to overcome, even when it's in us and around us, even when our start of our DNA as a nation had racism and slavery as a part, that in Jesus Christ there is hope to overcome. And there is a hope that we can see the chains that are there. And by the power of God, the Church of Jesus Christ can work together, listening and doing works of justice, becoming aware, and then finding our place in the story. We may not all agree, and we won't agree on politics, being the political structures and the way they change. But one way we can start towards a movement of being advocates to remove those structures and laws that oppress in hidden ways is to become informed. There are countless different places and areas where you can get involved. Becoming informed is the first step of finding out. In that church which I served in outside Atlantic City, the school district was going to be taken over by the state, as most places. Those with least resources do worst on the tests. But I had a group of black grandmothers in that church who were a formidable force. They were also retired teachers and school principals. And rather than protesting, which has its own voice, we formed a tutoring program. We fed the kids breakfast because we soon learned that hunger was a part of the problem on the test scores, and they went to work. They were a force to be reckoned with. Over the years, that tutoring program has grown, but the state never did have to take over the schools. Now that tutoring program has an annual budget of $40,000, and people from all over that county come and work with those kids who are now very multicultural. They were advocates, and they led the way into removing some of those structures that held those kids in bondage. And so I invite you again to ask yourself these questions. Have I ever witnessed an occasion when someone fell victim to personal, institutional, systemic, or social racism, and I did or said nothing, leaving the victim to address their pain alone? Have I ever witnessed an occasion when someone fell victim to personal, institutional, systemic, or social racism with me inflicting the pain, acting opposite of love of God and love of neighbor? Have I ever lifted up and aided a person who fell victim to personal, institutional, systemic, or social racism and paid a price for extending mercy to the other? How did I react? Did my faith grow? Am I willing to grow even more in faith through my actions?